Good evening, everybody, and welcome back for the next video in our webinar series. And we're joined tonight with Will Tollefson from ETSU, and Will's going to talk to us about best practices for ArcGIS Online and cartography. So thanks, Will, and take it away.
Sure thing. Yeah. Thanks for having me. So kind of what I wanted to talk about tonight, first off was just kind of overall goals of cartography or map design. And when we're doing cartography and designing our maps, it all comes back to really our kind of main goal here is communicating effectively to our audience, or our map readers. So making sure that we think through who is our audience, so who are we making the map for, and then what's the purpose? So what do we want to communicate to them, or what we want them to be able to do with that map? And so really those two questions are going to drive most of the decisions that we're making as we go through cartography. And I'm going to show several examples here in a little bit, but just kind of starting off first with a few of our hypothetical topics. So when we're working with GIS data in ArcGIS Online, or even any other platforms, really we have two main ways of showing information or layers. And those are our vector data. So that would be things like points, lines, and polygons. So drawing out a marker for where a city is could be a point. We could draw a line for a road or a river. And then we have polygons for things like state boundaries or counties. And then on the other side, we can also use what's called raster data. And so this is anytime we're using satellite imagery or data that uses grids or cells to show different information, usually by color. And so when we're working in ArcGIS Online, we have a couple different ways to show those different feature types, and I'll show you a couple examples of those. And then another thing to keep in mind too is what type of data we're showing. So beyond just whether it's point, line, polygon, or this kind of imagery or grid-based information, we can also think about, are we showing our information that's qualitative, so having to do with type or characteristic, or are we showing data that's more quantitative, so having to deal with numbers? And so when we're using data with those different kind of measurement types or qualities, we can use different symbols in ArcGIS Online to show those. So when we have those qualitative features, so again, dealing with type or characteristic, some of the good variables we can use for that would be things like our symbol shapes, or our colors that we're using. So using red versus green versus blue versus orange to denote those different types or characteristics of the data set. And then when we're working with quantitative or number-based data, here symbol size is a really good one we can use, as well as that color value. So is it light or dark? And we'll look at a few of those. So I'll go ahead and start sharing. I've got a map here with a few different data layers to highlight these topics. So kind of building off of what you showed, Michael, last time, I pulled some data from that same USGS earthquake, pulled out a CSV. This I had done a little bit earlier this in February for my students to work on a project. And I read that CSV into my ArcGIS Online map. And so I've just created an initial point layer. And with our point layer, when we're working in ArcGIS Online, anytime we want to go in and change symbology, we can go in and there's a button here that shows a little circle, square, triangle. When we hover over the different layers when they're turned on, we should see this interactive kind of submenu pop up. So when I click into that, I can then change how I want those symbols to show. So right now I'm just using a location only. So this is only showing me where those earthquake epicenters were. And within this, I have several different options. So if I click into the options of that single point, just showing where they are, I can change what symbol I'm using. That pop-up shows, right? Okay. And so here, you know, just generic shapes I can choose from. I can also adjust the symbol size, but this drop-down menu here is pretty fun. They have lots of these different symbols that we can pick from. So depending on what data you're mapping, you can pick something that matches. Some here, you know, disasters. So this is earthquakes. So look and see what do they have maybe that matches up. And so they've got several of these presets. Another one that I liked for earthquakes, it's just here in the basic. If I scroll down, they've got this little bullseye. I think these are pretty nice for my epicenters because they kind of look like that. And plus two, I like these because they're kind of see-through. So if I zoom in on one of these, you can start to see the data underneath it. I'll talk about pop-ups here in a second too. But then when we have a lot of earthquakes together, what's known as a swarm, those symbols start to coalesce and it looks like, oh, something really crazy is happening here. And these are all just presets. You can adjust the transparency. So this is especially useful if we're working with something like we have a lot of data layers or multiple data layers, and we want to show them at the same time. We can play around with that setting. And this visibility range is also really nice because it can set, basically you can have different layers that would appear or disappear when you zoom in or zoom out. And so that helps keep the map looking pretty clean when we're zoomed out and it's not overwhelming. But then as we get in closer to wherever it is you want to show or communicate information about, we can have more of those layers start to appear automatically using these visibility range sliders. Another cool thing, like I mean, you kind of already saw one example here, is the pop-up window. And so if I look at the pop-ups, this is one of the main advantages of using a web map instead of just a static or picture of a map. We can let our map readers explore a little bit, and we can build this into our story maps and web apps in ArcGIS Online so that our map readers can have a little bit more interaction. And so here, it's just reading in the different attributes of that data file that I pulled. Things like the time or the date, latitude, longitude, depth, magnitude. Some of this is useful, not all of it is. And so we can change what our map readers are seeing in those pop-ups too. So if I go back here, I'm gonna go ahead and just save that style for right now. I can go through this little ellipses at the end of that same menu where I set the style to edit my pop-ups. So we've got a configure pop-up button on this more menu where I can come in and change some of those. So I can change if I want it to list that all multiple attributes, or if I just want it to show one in particular. I like to show a list so there's more information there, but you can also configure that. So I can change what those would look like. So time I like, but it doesn't actually show a clock time. It just shows a day. So I'm going to keep that on display, but I'm going to change my field aliases. So this is really what the map reader will see when they click on it. So I'm going to switch this over to date. Latitude, longitude, those are okay. Depth is good. So this stands for magnitude. So I'm going to go ahead and write that forward. And then ID, that's not really that useful to the map reader, so I can uncheck that from the display. And then I might want to change this around. Since I started some with uppercase, I'll go ahead and make that quick change. And the reason I'm doing this is just to make it a little bit more easy to read and understand for my final audience. I might move latitude and longitude. Well, let's just move magnitude up. So I've got these little arrows on the side too, so I can change the order that they're displayed. So if I have date, then magnitude, and then this other information. So I hit OK here, and then OK back in my pop-up. So now when I click on one of these, I get that same information, but it's pared down a little bit easier for the common person to read than what comes from the USGS. Another cool thing with point data, so instead of just showing the single, like where was it, we can change that symbology based on attributes. And so with point data here, my earthquakes, it's pulling in those different attribute fields and letting me pick from what I want to show. So I can show an attribute maybe based on magnitude. So this is one of those quantitative, so based on numbers. So if I switch over to that, it's going to automatically change and show me a couple different options. So like I mentioned, when we're dealing with numbers-based data, symbol size is a good one. So it kind of pre-selects to this counts and amounts size. We could also show that with color, and this would be color value, so light to dark, and a couple of these other symbols. So with ArcGIS Online, one of the key things to know is that pretty much everything you can drill down into and play with the settings. So if I click here in my options, right now it's called what's proportional symbol. So each one gets its own size. I could change that. I could divide it into classes if I wanted to. So I could classify my data where I could play around with the break values with this little slider. So if I wanted to set one to say 6, fine tuning, and then the other to 5, I could set that in there and see what those look like. When I do this as well, I still have that option to change what symbol I'm using. So I could go back to my same kind of bullseyes, but that are still going to vary in size based on the magnitude or strength of that earthquake. So that's a good example for point data. I'm going to switch over now and look at an example of some Polygon data. So this is data that we created here at ETSU. So we have outlines or footprints of all of our different buildings. And you'll see right now it's grayed out because I have that set to where it's only going to show up once I zoom in to a certain extent. So I kind of keep zooming in here. Again, pop-ups. I hadn't configured this pop-up yet, and so it's still a lot of information that's not that useful. But when I come in and work with Polygon data, I can again change what symbols I want this to be. So clicking on that layer name over here in my contents, I can click on the change symbol. Right now, if I just use single symbol, options, again, clicking on the symbol. So now I have fill and outline options. So this allows me to go in and change, what do I want this to look like? So I could give it a nice navy blue fill, and then maybe our gold outline. So pick my ETSU colors. And I can say okay, and see what that would look like on my map. I can also adjust the transparency overall or of one part of this. So if I want my fill to be slightly transparent or no transparent to make it darker, and then the outline maybe a little bit thicker, but with some transparency. So you can just play around with all of these different settings to really fine tune what you want your symbols to look like on the map. And this is another one here where I think having attribute information could be useful. So with this one, one of the ones that I would like to show is our, let's see, where was it? Working on my trackpad. Let's see. Here we go. Oh, it's only showing second function. Wanted primary function attribute.
So those may be listed alphabetically instead of the order that they're listed in the table.
I see that now. Yes. Primary function. Thank you, Michael. I was like, I played with this earlier. So this is an example of that qualitative type of data. So instead of dealing with numbers, this is type. So whether it's housing, classrooms, offices, things like that. And so ArcGIS Online kind of picks up on that. And so it notices that I'm using qualitative data. And so instead of having those proportional symbols or the color value light to dark, it reads this types as unique symbols. And so it creates these colors. And again, I could go in here and edit each one of these by themselves if I wanted to, as well as change the labels. And so that kind of leads me into one of the other points for when we're working with cartography and map design. Oftentimes the data aren't really built for map design and display. They're there for analysis and eventually display, but some of these different wordings or the way that the text is written in the attributes may not be that helpful to a person. And so coming in and playing with the labeling or the field aliases, that's one way to make it way easier for your map reader to look at the data and see what it is you're trying to share. Same thing here. I can set that symbology. And then if I wanted to, I could play around with what that pop-up shows when I click on that to get a little bit more specific information for my final map. And then the third type of data I wanted to look at, zoom back out to the country level. I've got a drought and moisture surplus layer. So this is one that comes from the Living Atlas, but it is not the primary kind of subscription side. So it is available. There we go. And so this is an example of that raster type of data. So it's using these areas to fill in that are not polygons, they're actually grid cells. So if I zoom back in a little bit, you can see that gritty kind of nature of the data layer. And so when we're working with raster data, so here an example, it's opaque. So I can't really see through to my base map. So I might want to change that. And so this one, since it's coming from Living Atlas, it's not a layer that I really own or control. That same symbology option isn't there, but we do still have within that more option is we can change the image display. And so this is because it's raster data and I don't own it. So it's not in my organization or my personal account. But I can go through here and change. So right now it's set to unique values based on my moisture field, and I can see what those different attributes are. The creators of this layer have created this moisture field for the legend mainly. It's the same information if I switch over to value from 1 to 9, but they again, doesn't really mean much to just a random map reader. So they've created that moisture that gives us these more descriptive attributes. So when we work with raster data, instead of picking one color or a different group of colors to fill in different areas, we're going to work with a color ramp. And color ramps are really useful here. We have a lot of different ones that we can choose from. And you'll notice a few different types. So right now it's using what's called a divergent color ramp. So this means the areas that are near normal are drawn with this kind of neutral gray color. And then as we move into the drought side, we start getting stronger and stronger, in this case, kind of oranges. And as we move into surplus or more moisture, we get into deeper and deeper shades of blue. So anytime where we've got that middle kind of null or neutral color, and then we separate out, this is divergent scheme, and it's or color ramp, and it's really good for showing any sort of data that deviate from that average. So in this case, near normal to dry or near normal to wet. We could also do this with things like population change, or it's a growth or a decline, anywhere where you've got that really good, meaningful middle ground or divide in the middle of your data set. And so I could pick different ones if I wanted to do a sequential where we just go from light to dark. I could do that. It's a little bit less apparent though, where was really wet and where was really dry. And we can see that when we look at our legend, but having that divergent scheme for here, or this divergent color ramp, is really helpful to make that separation. Let's see, I like the kind of green browns. Yeah, something like that. Same idea, but where we're split in the middle. One thing I did want to look at here too was with this, I could also adjust, that transparency overall for the layer. So I could make it a little bit transparent so I could see my base map underneath. Or when we're working with raster data, oftentimes we'll go through and add other polygons or outlines on top. So one from the Living Atlas data is this world boundaries and places. So I've gone ahead and added that one. And so this is just outlines of states and regions around the world, as well as major cities. So it can kind of help give you reference if you're working with raster data set and you don't want to adjust that transparency. If we want those colors to come through really bright, we can do that. Or if you wanted a little bit more control, I've also added a states layer. So this one right now it's a layer, this polygon, and I can adjust that symbology again, where instead of having it as a fill, I just want to set it as a no color. So if we look at all the different color options down here at the bottom, there's this one box with a little red line through it. And so that's our no color option. And so that means I've got no fill. So the polygons will be hollow so I can see through the data. And I just want to choose an outline color that's not going to overlap with some of the data already. And so that's another way that could go in and give reference to where the map is without having to adjust that transparency. So there's lots of different things that we can do. And again, the main kind of stories here with ArcGIS Online is always drill into those little options. There's a lot that you can do and manipulate, but it's not super apparent when you first start. So just kind of playing around with your data is a really good way to get into that. And so then the very last thing I wanted to talk about was just, again, that legend considerations. So your legend is going to automatically update based on what you have turned on or off in your map. And these are going to follow through to your final story map or map app when you're sharing that for the contest. And so thinking through making sure that your text is really clear and easy to understand is pretty helpful. So if I go back here into my content, so these are already preset, so they're pretty good. If I turn those off and then I go back to my legend, again, since it's interactive, it's not going to show anything. If I come back to my buildings for ETSU, again, since I'm not zoomed in close enough, it's not showing up. So this is one of the things that it could be really useful when you're thinking about building your map design, is setting those scale ranges so that data maybe only comes on once you get close enough to really see it. So the scale setting that I have, the range right now for my building footprints, probably not even that helpful because it turns on when I'm still really far zoomed out and I can't see those. And again, here, these are pretty easy to read and understand, but depending on where you're getting your data, so especially if you're pulling it from like the CSV, it may not be that useful. There might be abbreviations like with mag instead of magnitude, something like that. Just little tweaks that really make a map a lot easier to read for our audience. So that was pretty much the main points of what I wanted to talk about.
So Will, just as a quick reminder for folks, as you make these changes, are they being saved automatically?
So I think most of those changes are. I haven't asked myself that in a while.
So maybe just as a best practice,
yeah,
save, just in case.
I think, once I closed out, it may not have applied all that same. So whenever I'm working in the Symbology here and I click the apply and the done, it would save it for the rest of my session, but you're right. Always hit our save button up at the top when you've got it set to the way that you want it. One thing too that I like to tell my students sometimes is if they're not sure about something, you can do this save as, and you could save it as a new copy. And so you could, map A, map B, and then get with whoever else you're working with on that and show them like, which one do you like better? And then kind of move forward with that copy as your main one.
And Will, this has been great. I actually learned some things in here about using raster data that I've never done because it's not something I usually use in ArcGIS Online. So thank you for sharing that. I did want to show you one thing though that might make your life easier. Can you go back to that change style option, but for the earthquake data?
Yeah.
And if you go back to your counts and amounts, and earlier you talked about going from a proportional symbol to a graduated symbol. So just so you know, where it says 5.02, you can just click on 5.02 and change that to 5.
Oh, yeah. I do, yes.
And then you can put those exactly where you want them.
Yeah, for sure. I always forget you can do that. And you can change the number of classes. So here, for my class, I pulled anything bigger than 4. And so it was 2020 up until mid-February of this year. So there was nothing beyond that 6.4 at the top. But you could play around with, based on what your data show, how many breaks or classes you would want to have in that. But thanks for that reminder. Yeah.
Well, Will, thank you so much for your time and sharing your expertise. And we'll get the video edited and posted. And we hope you have a wonderful and safe rest of your week.
Thanks. Thanks for having me on.